Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to do an if you like this, try that, and I wanted to look at fantasy works that are extremely well known and popular, and then recommend books that I think there's a decent chance that if you like one you'll like the other, or maybe you'll even like the other more, but they are not as well known. Jumping into it, and one that is pretty much repeatedly on every single list of greatest fantasy books of all time, you have The Name of the Wind. This is very highly rated, even with a lot of the review bombing that has come as a result of people waiting for the next book in this trilogy. But regardless, if you don't actually know too much about Name of the Wind, or maybe you know about it at a glance, you could say, but don't know that much about the writing or the plot or the character, it is following an unreliable narrator, and even that's up for debate, named Kvothe. And the reason that often people consider him an unreliable narrator is because he sounds so perfect in a lot of ways. He sounds truly like the hero of this tale, and he definitely has a reputation, so he's well known, but you question whether or not all this played out the way that he insists that it does. A lot of people really praise the writing of the story as well for being extremely lyrical, but also having a sense of poise to it, you could say, a sense of sophistication. It's still very approachable, but it's pretty at the same time. This way of telling the story where you have somebody that is relaying to someone else the events of their life, it's not just unique to Name of the Wind, and there are plenty of other books that follow this blueprint as well, but the one that I wanted to highlight would be Bloodsong by Anthony Ryan. For me, Bloodsong was a big success when I read it. Name of the Wind didn't work for me as much, and the reason is Name of the Wind, its character I did not find particularly likable, and you're with that character all the time. So if the character, and especially if you're a character-driven reader, if the character isn't one that you connect with, you find yourself drawn to, or all that interested in, then it can be very difficult even with all of the other elements that you really enjoy. And of course the same thing can be applied to Bloodsong. For me, the character of Vaelin I absolutely loved. You follow Vaelin from the time he is young, similar to how you follow Kvothe. And I think that a lot of the themes in Bloodsong and the events that you're watching were just so real, and it felt like something where you genuinely have your perspective shifted as you're reading it. And it actually, for me, made me reflect on how we often make assumptions, or we have certain first impressions that are inaccurate, and Bloodsong does a great job of showing that. The main character, Vaelin, is whisked off basically to this school that I always describe as basically the Navy SEALs training, but for children, and specifically a group of boys. And you see the other boys, some of them start to have friendships, some of them are the snotty kid or the kid that won't stop bragging about his family, and you're like, that kid's annoying, or that kid, I kind of feel bad for that kid. And then you hear more about their family history, you watch these boys grow up together, go through really grueling trials together, and then you follow them as they grow into men. And I cared so much about Vaelin, I cared about the other characters. Both of these are relatively low plot, so if you're somebody who you do not need this big bad antagonist who everybody is trying to defeat, if you don't need a hard magic system, you more so prefer almost the literary feel and great writing, but also just the feeling that you get when you're following, where you feel like you're transported and that you're right there alongside the characters. Both of these do it really, really well. Like I said, Bloodsong was just a little bit more to my liking because I really loved Vaelin. Before continuing on, I just want to say, if you yourself are a big fantasy reader and you want to provide your own recommendations and why for each of the ones or any of the ones that I talk about, feel free to do that so that anybody who comes to this video doesn't just have my recommendations, but all of yours as well. I am going to include one sci-fi on this list, where the one that is really popular is a sci-fi, but the book that I'm comparing it to is fantasy, which is why I'm letting it be in this video. But we'll go ahead and switch to that one, which would be Red Rising by Pierce Brown. This has so much success. There is a lot, of course, of overlap between fantasy and sci-fi readers as well. And for me, as a big fantasy reader, and I dabble in sci-fi here and there, Red Rising was really accessible in my opinion. It was definitely really easy to get into, and I didn't feel too daunted by it, or I didn't feel like, oh, I'm a fish out of water, I just don't know this genre very well. It doesn't feel like that at all. It's very approachable. And in Red Rising, you are following a caste system, and we are looking at our main character, Darrow, who is part of one of the lower classes, and he, through some events that transpire and are pretty much pushed forward by other people, he then has an opportunity to try and infiltrate the upper classes and break the system down from within. It's very action-packed, it's very edge of your seat, and it's quite expansive, so it can feel in some ways like you're reading a fantasy story. Not to say a sci-fi can't be expansive, but one thing that I feel like a lot of fantasy readers really like, and they really love it when they see it in their sci-fi too, is that feeling of really epic world building, which I think you get a lot of in Red Rising. The book that we're comparing it to, and I'm drawing specifically from the plot progression, would be The Will of the Many. This is definitely a booktube darling, and it's a newer work. A lot of people that have picked it up have also made the comparison to Red Rising, as you are following a class system, and both of these have somewhat Roman inspirations in them. So there's that as well. If you're a fan of that and you like seeing pieces of it in your stories, both of these do that. And The Will of the Many, you are following a young character who he's just trying to cope with the things that have happened in his past and get by, but he ends up kind of being thrust into trying to gain information for some other people. And those people want to do what they can with that information, but there's another group of people that want to break the system down, and our main character is kind of caught within the struggles and the tension that's being pulled between both of these groups. And you see some elements in both of their arguments that you're like, oh, I mean, I kind of get it. I get why they want to do that. And our main character is very principled. You get to know him. I think it takes more time to unveil his character than it does Darrow in Red Rising. Red Rising definitely pulls at your emotions immediately, and then this character, you get to know him throughout the story, so in that sense, they're a little different. And the characters themselves, I think in personality, are very, very, very different. But as I said, the plot progression and the world in general, and the idea of following this character who is just a single individual, it feels like there's no way they could ever topple this thing that has so much of their feet on the ground. They're really cemented. This is the way of life. It just feels like impossible to take this down. I really think they both established that really well. The Will of the Many only has one book out, Red Rising. There is a completed trilogy, and then there's a continuation trilogy after. So The Will of the Many, I can't comment on how similar it will be moving forward. The Will of the Many has magic in it, so that element's definitely very different. But I think there are far more similarities than there are differences. And then another really major one that is specific to the first books is there is somewhat of a school setting as well. Next up, we have The Lies of Locke Lamora, and the book that I'm going to recommend would be Mask of Mirrors. The reason being, I think Lies of Locke Lamora, a lot of people really appreciate how much the city itself in the story feels like its own character. It feels real, it feels lived in, it feels like it has a history, it feels like the architecture has meaning to it. And in that sense, Mask of Mirrors and it, I think, are really, really similar. You also follow con artists in both of these. And in both of them, it's not just this character type that just gets thrown in to sound cool. It's not like they're a con artist, but then you never actually see the con. You see the main characters in both of these trying to pull off certain cons. So they have this heist feeling in both of them. And besides just the city itself feeling so alive and being very present in the story, it's not just that, it's the way in which the cities are described that feel somewhat similar as well. They both have somewhat of a Venetian setting, and I think that's a little bit different. Most of us are accustomed to fantasy that has more of either medieval feeling to it or sometimes Norse mythology inspired or Greek mythology inspired. I do think that the characters in Mask of Mirrors, actually I think this is somewhat true of Lies of Locke Lamora, I just think it's more so of Mask of Mirrors. There's like this sensuality to the characters, and there's like this dark romanticizing of everything, it feels like, in Mask of Mirrors. I think Lies of Locke Lamora has a little bit less of that. Lies of Locke Lamora is a little bit more about its charm and about its snarkiness and cleverness, and Mask of Mirrors, I really think, ups the sensual feel. But they all have a variety of characters, and I don't just mean literally like there are people within the story that are called characters. I mean like what a character that guy is. That way of using the word character. They have very distinct personalities, and they have individuals that you really wonder, can I trust this person? I kind of feel like I like them, but I don't know if I should like them. Okay, they're making this deal with them. It feels like this person's gonna cross them. You're kind of on the edge of your seat the whole time. Next up, I think that both of the books that I have read by these authors have a certain feeling to them that is reminiscent of classic fantasy. I do think that their writing styles are very different. So in that sense, they're not alike. But if you don't really mind the writing styles being different and the tone being different, and you just want those stories that feel like classic fantasy, I would say if you like Michael J. Sullivan, check out Rise of the Ranger. Both of these pull from those classic fantasy character types, from classic fantasy races, from the world building elements we've seen a lot of times. You'll have certain characters like elves, for example, where they live long lives and they're very beautiful, and sometimes they might fall in love with a human, but then there's questions that you get it. They're going to have some of those things that you've seen before, which is not a criticism. I think there's a way to do it where you can give kind of nods to the things that have come before, but then have your own unique characters and your own unique plot lines in the story, and I think both of them do that. The differences in the tones, if you're curious, I would say Michael J. Sullivan has much more of a fun, almost like bromance feel to their works. Not to say there aren't any female characters, but you will find some of the male characters. There's a lot of bromances in his works. Even when there's serious things going on, there is just this silliness to it, whereas Rise of the Ranger, I would say, has more of an epic feeling to it. It's not that it's really dull and dry and boring or anything like that. It's just that it's going to have something that feels a little bit more pressing, like the stakes are really high. Even though both of them have high stakes, there's just something about Rise of the Ranger where you feel like there's imminent danger. Regardless, though, I do think that the way in which they build upon classic fantasy tropes, I think you're gonna, if you like one, like the other one. The last one for today would be if you are a fan of Sanderson. And Sanderson's tough because I actually feel like it's not the easiest. The way he writes, it's very much science fiction fantasy. He has really hard magic systems that lean more into feeling like science, hence why it's more like sci fantasy. The worlds, they feel really well realized, but they almost, with how detailed he gets, they feel like other planets that actually exist. And so there's just something about his writing that sort of, it straddles the line of science fiction and fantasy, but it also has these really epic, awesome moments and characters that are lovable, but also frustrating at times. And it can be really difficult, I find, to highlight stories that have a similar feel. And without those stories feeling like they're just trying to follow in the footsteps. And the closest one that I can think of, as far as the worlds themselves and the attachment that you might get to the characters, would be Winnowing Flame by Jen Williams. This is one that I really love and I hype up quite often. I would say Winnowing Flame has more of a science fiction feel than anything by Sanderson I've read. With the exception, of course, of maybe his actual sci-fi series, but I'm more thinking of like Stormlight Archive as an example. Winnowing Flame, there is this sense, and I'll draw the comparison specifically to Stormlight, where in both of them, you have these characters that exist within a certain world that clearly has remnants of something that came before, and it's a mystery, the specifics of what transpired, but it feels like something is going to return. Both of them have that present. You can't give too many details about that in case people haven't read. You don't want to reveal anything. But in Winnowing Flame, you have characters that are trying to unearth what has happened in the past so they can be prepared for whatever the threat might be if it returns. And in Stormlight Archive, you have a very similar plot element, and then the way the worlds are revealed to you and the accessibility of both of them. I think there is a sense of feeling like your feet aren't firmly on the ground and it's going to take a while before you have an understanding of what's transpiring. But then once you start to be clued in, then the world building reveals just become really off the walls. You almost need to take a sec to process everything that's happening. But then also your characters don't have any time, so they're just trying. It feels like every step they take, the threat has, you could almost say, taken two. And so it feels like they're always just a step behind. And well, okay, now that I'm thinking about what I just said, if I'm taking one, they're taking two, eventually it's gonna be more than one step ahead, but you understand what I'm saying. It just feels like they're just barely not quite where they need to be, And as a reader, that very much puts you on the edge of your seat. You're so nervous for the characters. You feel like you don't really know what's going on. It feels like they don't know what's going on. You're trying to puzzle it out and they're trying to puzzle it out. And that feeling, I haven't found too many other series that do that and that have these worlds that are just so interesting. And you just can't help but feel completely fascinated by the creativity of these authors. One last thing I'll say, I do think that Sanderson writes, there are some very dark plot lines, but his characters, the way in which they talk is a little bit more wholesome, you could say, a little more PG, and the way in which the characters talk in Winnowing Flame is not necessarily, so just want to give that heads up that that element of the stories is a little bit different. But anyway, if you liked this video and found it helpful, I will have another with the same setup, just different books that we're diving into. Then I'm also going to get into what I'm calling recommendation fails. And these are when you have really popular works and the books that get recommended, I'm slightly confused by. So if you're interested in either of those, be on the lookout. But anyway, if you are interested in any of these, I will have in the description bar down below all of them linked. If you, of course, like I said previously, have your own recommendations, feel free to leave those. I hope you have a great rest of your day though, and I'll see you later. Bye.